Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bonnie Burnham, the president of the World Monuments Fund, and it's my great pleasure tonight to launch a new tradition at the World Monuments Fund that will continue into the future, the annual H. Peter Stern Lecture. Peter has been a stalwart supporter of the World Monuments Fund, a great source of wisdom and a beloved friend for many, many years to all of the leadership of this organization. He stepped down last year from the board after 40 years of service. And we wanted to do something that would not only honor him, but honor the tradition of the way that a lot of people come to us and become interested in the World Monuments Fund, which is through their travels. Peter, when he was a student at Harvard, read the autobiography of Toynbee, who wrote extensively on monuments and became very engaged with them all around the world. And he decided to make it a lifelong pursuit to visit all these places. And it was midway through that pursuit that he learned about the World Monuments Fund and became one of its inaugural trustees and one of its long-term supporters. So this is our first annual lecture on travel, and we have many more wonderful ideas queued up for the future. But we're delighted to have our first lecturer be Pico Iyer, someone who I think shares a lot of common ground with Peter in terms of the depth and breadth of his pursuits. He's an Indian by inheritance writer, journalist, and author who, however, grew up essentially in the UK and the United States, and who now has a Japanese wife and spends most of his time in Japan. He studied at Eton, at Oxford, and at Harvard. He's traveled the world in pursuit of, I suppose you might say, greater knowledge. He describes himself as a global village on two legs and considers himself to be a citizen of the world. He writes widely for Time Magazine, Harper's, the New York Review of Books, and other places, including internet sources. And his most recent book is called The Man Inside My Head. It's the story of his life juxtaposed with Graham Greene. It's just been out a few months. I think it came out this winter. And I encourage you all to get your own copy. Before turning the lecture over to Pico Iyer, I just wanted to quote from one of his columns called Why We Travel, which was published on the internet, and I think in other places as well. He quotes George Santayana as saying, "There is wisdom in turning as often as possible from the familiar to the unfamiliar. It keeps the mind nimble, it kills prejudice, and it fosters humor." And if that, I think that more than anything else would describe Peter Stern's pursuit over many years as he traveled the world and enriched himself from the process. I'd like to thank his wife Helen for helping us put together this evening and get this series launched. And now I'd like to welcome Mr. Pico Iyer.
Thank you so much. If even a little bit of that were true, I'd be really honored. And I'm so honored to be here. So touched to see so many people on this day when New York is sort of impersonating London. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm guessing you can all see me above this podium. I say that because a couple of years ago, the very distinguished New York Times columnist David Brooks came to my hometown, sometime hometown, Santa Barbara. And as soon as he arrived on the stage, there was this excited rustle of whispers all around. So as a shameless journalist, I had to lean in to find what people were saying. They were saying, "Gosh, he's so small. We can barely see him over the podium." And then Mr. Brooks gave, I thought, a masterful hour-long lecture and answered questions for 30 minutes, and then he went off the stage at the end of the evening, and everybody again began speaking, so I had to find out how they had found his lecture. And at the end of it, they were saying, he is very, very small. And so I wondered if poor Mr. Brooks had to come all the way to Santa Barbara to deliver that message. And I'm guessing whatever I say or don't say this evening, you can go home saying, that person who delivered the first H. Peter Stern lecture, he was diminutive. But as I was flying over here last night from California, I was recalling with great vividness how 13 years ago, on New Year's Day, my mother and I awoke in our respective rooms at 3 in the morning, not, you can be assured, our usual custom, and staggered blearily out into the lobby where there were a handful of other people waiting, and got into a minivan, and then drove for 45 minutes right into the heart of the Cambodian jungle. And at the end, we got out and were handed little lanterns and invited to walk through the heart of one of the great temples of Angkor. So as I was walking through, there was this zigzagging trail of lanterns in front of me, and there were lights along the side of the path, and you could really feel the jungle breathing, and you could feel the spirits that had gathered there over many, many centuries. And we walked through room after room after room, and finally came, astonishingly and unexpectedly, to a clearing where various tables had been laid out with white tablecloths and all the appurtenances for a champagne breakfast as the first sun of the new year rose over the mountains and greeted us. And then, having gorged ourselves, we went back into the heart of this temple compound, Priya Khan, and there Mr. John Sanday of the World Monuments Fund told us the whole history of the temple. He described how the WMF had come into Cambodia at a time when there were no tourists, no telephones, you could hear gunfire all around you in the jungle. And he explained beautifully how the WMF was working really to train the Cambodians to look after their own heritage, and not just, of course, working to restore the temple after what it had been through, decades, centuries of warfare and fire and flood, but also to protect it deep into the future against all the warfare and fire and flood that would possibly ensue. And especially as more and more tourists were discovering Cambodia, the new pressures that that would bring also. And then, almost as if to show us what was at stake and what was possible, he invited a group of young girls, probably 10 to 12 years old, in radiant gilded silks, to come out and start performing classical Khmer dance in the Hall of the Dancers, where perhaps 800 years ago such dances had taken place. And of course, it was a breathtaking, astonishing New Year's Day, like none that we'd ever experienced before. And we were so inspired by it that the very next year we went to see in the new year, and in fact the new millennium, in Easter Island. And the year after that, my mother and I went to see in the new year in Jordan and Syria. And I suppose because I'd been traveling for 25 years at that point, I knew something about what the WMF was doing in terms of protecting so many of the places I care about, from Ladakh to Peru and from London to Nara. But it really made a difference getting this on-the-ground, very practical demonstration of what its work involves, especially, of course, in this culture where just a generation before people had been killed, even for wearing glasses or even for being able to read and write. And I've never forgotten that moment, because I think what it really taught me was that when you go to a place like Angkor, the first thing that strikes you is the wonder and the beauty and how much the site gives you. But Act 2 of the process really is beginning to think about what you can give back to it in return. And I know many of my friends who don't travel think that travel is rather like a passive activity. It's like coming into this auditorium and listening to somebody speak, or watching a play or a film or an opera. But I think, and I'm sure most of you would agree, it's much more of a conversation, and it's really a give and take. And every now and then I will take myself on a holiday, and I'll try to force myself not to do anything. And I find I'm just sleepwalking through, and I really return home very much the same person who left. But as soon as I give myself a project, even if it's writing an article for a magazine that has no interest in such article, instantly I'm awake, and the place around me comes to life, and I'm engaged with it. I'm asking questions of it. I'm thinking about it. I'm not sitting in my room watching CNN. I'm out on the streets trying to get deeper and deeper into it and engaging with it as with a mysterious stranger whom I've just met. So I think really for all those reasons, I'm so incredibly honored to be here speaking with and for the World Monuments Fund. And I really want to thank Chairman Ostrom and President Burnham for inviting me to be here, especially for this auspicious first lecture in a series I hope will go on for many, many years. And I really want to thank Lisa Ackerman, who pretty much every day for the last 9 months has been dealing with the disembodied emails from rural Nara from me. And most of all, I am so pleased to be talking in celebration of Mr. Stern. And although I met him only 5 minutes ago, I think I feel as if I've been shadowing him or following in his footsteps, as President Burnham was saying, all my life. I went through the same English schools with their notorious hazards and blessings that I think he went through. And then I followed him to his alma mater up in Boston. And most of all, of course, I've followed him around the world. And from what I've heard over the years, Mr. Stern is not just one of the most long-standing trustees and donors of the World Monuments Fund and a former vice chairman, but also somebody who led tours for the WMF and who has worked incredibly hard on behalf of so many of the sites that we really care about, including, in fact, Angkor and Easter Island. And I always got the sense that he has exemplified the very spirit of attention and thoughtfulness and curiosity and questingness that this organization speaks for. And I think for these many years, I suppose I've regarded the World Monuments Fund as a fellow traveler in some ways, and a guide and a counselor. But what I've admired about it is not just that it's drawing our attention to the Taj and the Alhambra and Preah Khan and so many sites in the United States, but maybe even more that it's turning the searchlight on those places inside ourselves that need to get excavated, having to do with attention and watchfulness and responsibility. And I was doubly excited, as you heard from President Burnham, when I heard how Mr. Stern in youth had been inspired by the late historian Arnold Toynbee, because as it happens, my father was a philosopher at Oxford, and his very first book, more than 50 years ago, arose out of collaboration and conversation with none other than Arnold Toynbee. And then my father moved my mother and me to California and started collaborating with Mr. Toynbee there too. And I think I've always been very fired by two among many of Mr. Toynbee's ideas. The first is that a life that does not go into action is a failure. And secondly, that civilization is a movement, not a condition, that it's a journey and not just a harbor. And I'm guessing that pretty much everybody in this room knows more about preservation and education than I do, so I thought I wouldn't tell you what you already know, but that maybe the most useful thing that I could do this evening was talk a little bit about two cultures that I've got to know a little and got to love a lot over the last 30 years. And to that extent, what travel has brought me, but also the questions that travel inevitably precipitates. Because I think those are the questions that the World Monuments Fund has both dramatized before the world and often tried to resolve. And I apologize that when you look up at this beautiful stage, the only thing you see is scrawny me and a bottle of water. And that's mostly because I'm too low-tech, unfortunately, and incompetent to set up a slideshow. But I think it's also because of my sense that images do a great service in bringing the beauties of the world before us. And they sometimes also show us the places that are crumbling and that we need to be thinking more about. But I think when you get to the deeper level about what you can bring to the places of the world, then you have to go perhaps below the image to the word or the thought or the idea. Or at least that's my justification. But I do apologize because I know it's hard to concentrate when somebody is just here babbling away. I was at Google a few years ago, and I was talking, just as I'm talking now, and then I looked across the audience, and they were looking stricken. They were looking really, really unhappy. And I realized that they were waiting for the show to begin, especially in Google. And finally, I had to say, I'm really, really sorry. I don't even have a PowerPoint. So it's pretty much guaranteed everything I say will be powerless and pointless. And I fear that may apply tonight also. But as we stand here on 35th Street, inevitably my mind goes back 29 years because I was living just down the street, 10 minutes walk away. And I actually had pretty much the job and the life I might have dreamt of as a little boy, because I had a nice apartment on Park Avenue and 20th, and I had a great job with Time magazine writing about world affairs. And in those days, as many of you remember, both Time and Newsweek had this unusual system whereby half the writers traveled around the world covering the news as it broke, and the other half were people like me who sat in little cubicles in Midtown Manhattan and, drawing on our colleagues' reports, produced the articles that appeared in the magazine every Monday. And my very first year on the job, I made, I think, 3 fatal mistakes. The first was I decided to take a holiday and to visit some of the places that I was writing about but had never seen. The second was I chose for that holiday Southeast Asia, and I'm sure many of you know it's a dangerously irresistible part of the world. Most people who go there never come back. So I decided to go to Thailand and Burma and Hong Kong. And my third mistake was a curious one because I was traveling on Japan Airlines and I had to fly back from Narita. And so Japan Airlines put me up overnight outside Narita Airport to wait for my connection back to New York City. And many of you have probably suffered through the Nikko Narita Hotel. So there I was, and my flight was leaving in early afternoon, and I had a few hours to kill. And so I thought, why don't I go in and see this little town of Narita? Nothing lost, although I imagined it would be like Queens around JFK or Inglewood near LAX. So I took the shuttle bus into the town. And it was a late October day, and some of you may know that peculiar mix of brilliance and wistfulness that characterizes the Japanese autumn. The skies are blue and cloudless, warmer than California, but there's just a trace of sharpness and chill that suggests that the darkness and cold of winter is on its way. And as I walked around this little town, not knowing that in fact it was a famous pilgrimage center for 3 centuries, just the way a few little children were playing in the park around the central temple, and the way the shoes were laid out very neatly, of course, outside the tatami restaurants whose windows looked out on the first turning leaves. And I suppose just the polished stillness in the air really pierced me with a sense of familiarity. And I thought, for no good reason, I know this place better than I know the street on which I grew up in Oxford, England, and the house where I've been keeping my things for many years in Santa Barbara, California. So by the time I boarded my plane back to New York City that afternoon, I decided to move to Japan. It had that strong an impression on me. And I suppose a part of me felt that working for Time magazine, 4 blocks away from Times Square, I was learning a lot about the stimulation and news and the public official world, but I felt that there must be another, more inward, reflective, private world that I couldn't learn about. So I suppose like many people who were based in California, especially in those days, I decided to move straight from Time magazine to live for a year in a temple in the back streets of Kyoto. And of course, as soon as I arrived in my temple, my high-minded year there lasted a week. Because as soon as I arrived, I found that living in a temple in Kyoto doesn't mean sitting on a wooden platform and contemplating the full moon and writing depthless haiku. It means scrubbing floors and sweeping leaves and cleaning plates and doing, I suppose, all the kind of menial stuff of which I'd had more than enough in my many years in English boarding school. So I bailed out of the temple very, very quickly. But 25 years later, I still live near Kyoto in a 2-room apartment with my wife that's probably more monastic than my room in the temple had been. And I sometimes think that if the first blessing of the modern world is that all of us in this room can see the places, such as Kyoto or Angkor, Easter Island, that our grandparents could only dream about, the second is that we can actually live in these secret homes. And I'm, again, rather notorious among my friends as somebody who's not very good at PowerPoints and technology generally. I'm the man without the cell phone these days. That seems to be my name. I'm like James Bond in reverse because I don't have the most elementary tools of the 21st century. And yet, of course, thanks to telephones and email and planes, I've been living in Japan for 25 years on a tourist visa and still can communicate with my bosses and friends here in New York City. And so I'm very grateful to technology for allowing me to live in this place of my dreams, in effect. And as I began to settle down in Kyoto, I noticed, as any of you who've been there surely has, that in so many places, it's the most hushed and pristine and otherworldly place on the planet, like nothing else that I've seen anywhere else. But at the same time, in the 1980s, old Kyoto was being devastated at the speed of light. And the city that had withstood 1,200 years of almost constant warfare and fire and earthquake, and even, of course, been spared American bombs during World War II, thanks to the wise intercession of various men in Washington who realized, and women too, who realized that Kyoto was really part of the treasure of all mankind. Having survived all of that, it was becoming a victim of the boom economy that was sweeping across Japan in the late 1980s. And in those days, if you had a $500 bill and you put it on the ground, that amount of ground would be worth $500. So what had taken centuries to build up was being wiped out in a week. And in fact, in one decade before I got there, 40,000 of the machiya, or the pre-war wooden houses, had been razed to the ground. For every single car that was in the narrow lanes of Kyoto after the war, there were 80 cars clogging those lanes by the time I got there. And soon after I got there, they started constructing a 17-story hotel right in the heart of downtown that, of course, disfigured the skyline by dwarfing everything else around it. But from the point of Kyoto, more importantly, broke up the sight lines between downtown and the northeastern hills. And the hills to the northeast in Kyoto have always been associated with demons, and therefore threats to the city, and therefore protective spirits. But it's been important to the psychic survival of Kyotoites that they always be able to keep an eye out, but suddenly now they couldn't. There was even talk in those days of redirecting and redoing, I suppose, the central Kamo River that winds through Kyoto so that it would look like the Seine in Paris. And I think many of us in those days thought of the classic line from Basho, the 17th century Japanese poet, "Even in Kyoto, I miss Kyoto." And as I began to see what was going on, the struggle, I suppose, for the soul of the city, I found, rather to my surprise, that there were two groups that were working overtime to try to protect the city before it was too late. And the first were the monks, partly because, of course, they still exercise a lot of power in a city of 2,000 temples, partly because they're sitting on most of the choice real estate, and partly because everybody knows they're integral to the city's tourist industry, which is a vital one. 50 million people come to Kyoto as tourists every year. But the second group that was working really, really hard, more unexpectedly to me, were foreigners. In fact, people like me who'd moved to Kyoto precisely because it didn't look like Paris and the Seine. And in fact, when the Kyoto Buddhist Association, which draws together members from 1,000 of the city's temples, decided to put out a full-page ad asking people to rally behind their city, they placed it not in the Yomiuri Shimbun or the Asahi Shimbun, the two great newspapers of Tokyo, but where else? In the New York Times, because they felt it was only people like those here and those in this room who would really put themselves out to try to rescue Kyoto. And 20 years later, I'd say the struggle still goes on. Just 2 months ago, a huge aquarium was built near Kyoto Station over the protests of the city's citizens in order to gather more tourists. But on the other hand, I would say in the quarter century I've known it, Kyoto has actually grown more beautiful, more stylish, certainly more open and more international. And again, the reasons for this are maybe not the ones that I might have imagined. For example, when the young American writer Arthur Golden brought out his book Memoirs of a Geisha, and then it was turned into a movie, suddenly it seemed to awaken the Japanese to this industry that had almost fallen into oblivion. And suddenly they realized what a treasure they were sitting on in the geisha industry, to the point where now young women from all across Japan travel to Kyoto and spend $150 just to be done up as a geisha for a day. And I suppose more substantially, young women from all across Japan travel to Kyoto and actually put themselves through the really rigorous training in playing the shamisen and mastering classical dance in order to become apprentice geisha. I'd say that book and the film really have revived the whole institution. Likewise, there's another American who loves Kyoto, Alex Kerr, who started buying up the wooden houses and redecorating them, making them comfortable, and then opening them up as places for people to stay when they came to visit. And I'm guessing this is going to be so successful, many Japanese will follow suit, and that these old wooden houses will actually be something of fashion with a place in the future as well as in the past. In fact, the World Monuments Fund has been working on behalf of various hidden imperial convents in Kyoto and Nara. And I will confess, I have been living around those two cities for 25 years, and I'd never even known of the existence of those convents until I read about them in the WMF literature. And I think one thing that the World Monuments Fund has done so wonderfully is to point out that if you take a single wooden building out of a neighborhood, you're not just transforming the space that it once occupied. Of course, you're transforming the look, the flavor, the rhythm of the entire neighborhood. If you pulled out one tooth from Angelina Jolie's face, her beauty would be gone forever. I'm sure she would never get a job again. And I've always loved, when I travel, that now celebrated line from Proust, that we travel not in search of new sights, but in search of new eyes. And with new eyes, even the old sights become interesting and fresh. And it seemed to me that actually foreigners were importing new eyes to Japan. They were importing, of course, new techniques and new ideas and new innovations. But as much as anything, they were bringing a global perspective to perhaps Kyoto people who'd never had a chance to step outside Kyoto or Japan, to remind them of everything that they have that is the envy of the world and can't be found anywhere else. I think maybe the third blessing of the modern world, of course, is that at the same time, the Japanese are traveling as never before. And again, that's something that we can't take for granted. When I was growing up as a little boy, indeed, until the age of 1964, no Japanese person was allowed to travel as a tourist or out of mere curiosity. You could only travel on government official business. And of course, for 220 years in its relatively recent history, no Japanese could leave Japan on pain of death. And I think what's happening now is that the Japanese are traveling to Europe, say, and seeing Soleil Lumière shows there, and then bringing that idea back to Kyoto, with the result that maybe 15 years ago, Kyoto temples began what they call light-ups, whereby temples open their doors after nightfall and really admit you into this illuminated wonderland where you walk around stands of bamboo and maple leaves eerily and softly lit up, and picturesque narrow streets are lit up with lanterns, and it turns into a magical evocation of Kyoto in the 17th century. At the same time, I think Japanese are coming to Starbucks, for example, but certainly going to the open air cafes of Europe and realizing what a wonderful thing it is to dissolve the boundaries between indoors and out. And they've introduced into Kyoto the notion of al fresco dining or al fresco drinking of tea and coffee. And since Kyoto is a university city, I think it's suddenly brought a new sense of youth and possibility and outdoorsness, sunlight, to the city that wasn't there when I arrived. You can eat wonderful Indian, Thai, Vietnamese, Turkish food in Kyoto, all of it cooked by young Japanese who have traveled to those countries, enjoyed their tastes and brought them back and reproduced them better in Japan than you would find in their original locations. And of course, this exposure to the world does bring its hazards, like the idea of turning the center of Kyoto into the Seine. But I think when it comes to a very grown-up, mature, old society like Japan's, it is fairly wise about knowing what it can learn from the outside world and what it can leave behind when it returns to Japan. Now remember, I was once staying at Tawaraya, which you may know as a 350-year-old ryokan, or traditional inn, that sits in a very, very thin lane in the heart of Kyoto and has been hosting kings and prime ministers and Jack Nicholson, Steven Spielberg, Robert Oppenheimer, all kinds of people for many, many centuries. And I was talking to its owner, Mrs. Sato, who is the 12th generation manager of the place, and she said this wonderful thing to me about how, in order to keep the spirit of the place intact, she had to keep changing the style of it. So that, for example, she knew that a modern customer coming even to a Japanese inn likes to have a telephone and a television in the room. So she put one into each of the 19 rooms, but she covered them in fabric so that when you walked into it and for as long as you wanted it, it looks like a classic Japanese tatami space. Also, through her own travels, she'd brought in design elements from China and India and Indonesia, but of course she'd put them into a Japanese whole. And I think I came away with this idea that a place almost has to remain in movement in order to remain itself. Again, there's that famous line from The Leopard by Lampedusa: if you want things to stay the same, they have to change. And I think the idea, of course, is not that places shouldn't change, but just that they should change in a way consonant with their character. That's why I think for me, often an 80-year-old grandmother is more, great-grandmother, is more beautiful than a 16-year-old girl if that 16-year-old girl is trying to look like Lindsay Lohan or Janet Jackson or somebody who she's not, while the grandmother is very content with exactly who she is. I'd say that maybe the fourth blessing of the modern world is, of course, that Japanese are now coming to our country, and just as we are telling them what is special and worth preserving in their land, they're doing the same for us. And whether it's Emily Dickinson's room in Amherst, which I think receives a disproportionately large number of visitors from Japan, or the old cowboy ghost towns of the Wild West, I'm so happy that the WMF does a lot to preserve Route 66, for example, or certain modern architectural wonders. I remember when I and my friends were growing up in England, all we wanted to do was drive down Route 66. It meant much more to us than the wonders of Florence or Venice, because they were much closer to us and we could take them for granted. But the wide open spaces of the far west seemed an astonishment. Well, 2 years after my life, I suppose, was turned around, really, by that overnight stay in Narita, I went to Tibet for the first time, and I'm sure quite a few of you have been there. And if you've been there, you know that it's really hard not to be affected by those intense, sharp, cobalt skies and the shafts of sunlight coming into the dusty rooms there, and the monks rocking back and forth in the corners over their sutras. And maybe it's just the high altitude and the thin air, but it's the only place I've ever been where I felt I was not just on the rooftop of the world, but really almost on the rooftop of my being. I was in some altered state or some part of myself that I never had a chance to visit ordinarily. And in 1985, Lhasa, Tibet, looked strikingly similar to the way you might dream or hope Lhasa would look like. It was just a cluster of two-story whitewashed houses, really in a labyrinth of little lanes set under the protective gaze of the Potala Palace. And in the evenings, when lights were put on in 1,000 rooms of the Potala, it almost did seem to glow down over the city. And of course, so many of the monasteries and temples were in ruins by 1985. The first strains of Hotel California could already be heard. There was already talk about opening a Rambo cafe. But nonetheless, as excited as we were to be seeing Tibet for the first time, it wasn't possible before that, I think the Tibetans were even more excited to be meeting people like us. Because as of 1980, only 2,000 Westerners had been to Tibet in the whole of its recorded history, and 1,000 of them had been in a British military expedition in 1903 or 1904. So it was a thing of wonder for the Tibetans just to lay eyes on people from New York City. Well, I went back to Tibet 5 years after that, and as all of you know, in 1990, Lhasa was under martial law, and there were tanks right outside the outskirts of the city, and there were armed policemen walking along the rooftops right outside the central square. And the only people allowed into the Potala Palace in 1990 were foreigners, but we were allowed only to go into it from the back to the front, really into the counter-auspicious direction, while Tibetans stood at the gates, wistfully looking at this building that meant so much to them, but that they were not allowed to visit. And then I went back to Tibet earlier in this century, and as all of you know, Lhasa now occupies a space literally 20 times larger than it did in 1950. By one Western scholar's count, there are 658 brothels on the main streets alone. There are blue glass shopping malls everywhere that makes it look like Las Vegas. And in fact, for most parts of the city, you can't even see the Potala Palace. That said, I would say that the spirit of Tibet is maybe even stronger now than when I first visited in 1985. The very fact that the culture is embattled has really awoken, I think, an intensity of devotion unlike anything I've seen almost anywhere else in the world. And if you go to the Jokang temple, the central holy place in Lhasa, you will see people, really faces, I suppose, from the furthest reaches of human experience and from the remotest corners of Tibet. And many people will still walk 3-4 months, occasionally prostrating themselves every step of the way in order to come to this holy place. And it's lit up only by dim, flickering candlelight. And you see just tears rolling down the cheeks of people there, and their eyes alight when they're next to their holy shrines. And from dawn to midnight, dozens of people are prostrating again and again and again outside its entrance. And it's very, very hard to forget something as shaking as that. 70 years ago, Tibetans could take Tibet for granted. And now, of course, they can't. And so they're really bringing all their fervor to those parts of their culture that remain. And I've been lucky because for 38 years now, I've been talking and traveling with the Dalai Lama. My father met the Dalai Lama as soon as he came into exile in 1959, and I suppose I inherited that connection. And I think, as I see it, the sovereign virtue of the Dalai Lama is that because he's been a head of state for 72 years now, he is a super realist. He's as pragmatic a soul as any person I've met. He has no interest in wishful or romantic or abstract solutions. He just wants to deal with the here and now. And so whenever I say things akin to what I was just saying to him, he points out that Tibet was much too isolated before. And he always says that Tibetans are really, really grateful for the material and the modern developments that Beijing has brought to them. Without Beijing, they probably wouldn't have access to those. And he always stresses that all Tibetans are really happy economically to be part of the People's Republic of China and part of this fast-rising economic powerhouse, even as he also asks whether all the economic developments have to come at the cost of the elimination of a unique culture and language and religion. But I think the main thing that he stresses, together with his great friend and almost his running mate, Desmond Tutu, and together with Bono and Bill Gates, and I'd say so many of the central players on our global stage, is just this sense that the very notion of near and far has completely extinguished, dissolved in our lifetime. And as the Dalai Lama puts it, there's no even notion of us or them. The very idea of us and them is outdated because we're aware in the global order, consciously, in so many different ways, of the fact that the business of anywhere is the business of everywhere, that we're all knit together into a single body. Where I spend time in California, you're often reminded many days of the year, 25% of the pollution in Los Angeles, as you know, comes from the People's Republic of China. Economically, if tomorrow the markets in Singapore collapse, in 3 minutes the consequences are going to be felt in New York or in London or in Zurich and Hong Kong. And in so many ways, we realize that we are not functioning independently at all. In classical Buddhist thought, of course, there's this idea of Indra's net, which is a cobweb that reminds us that everything is interconnected. And of course, the internet is a perfect example of that, a metaphor of that, a vessel for that. And so, for example, the Dalai Lama always tells the Tibetan people that anything they do to hurt China is only going to hurt Tibet. And he reminds the people in Beijing that anything they do to help Tibet is only going to help China. In the same way that if our country, let's say, were to attack Iran tomorrow, one of the first victims would be our country, because we depend on Iran and its neighbors in so many different ways. And I think one aspect of that is to say that if the world is getting smaller, that only means that our field of responsibility is getting much, much larger, that essentially the caves of Lalibela are just as close to us as Taos Pueblo, or conversely, the cloisters here in New York are just as much the world's concern as the Jokang Temple in Lhasa. And also that none of our simplistic notions of what is modern and what is ancient really pertain anymore. And one of the things that I love Professor Toynbee for saying is that he was trained in a very rigorous classical way, but he never learned how to drive. So he would say that when he went to Turkey, for example, he sometimes knew more about Islamic culture and the Ottoman past and the poems of Rumi and Hafiz than the Turks he met around him. But they were the ones who could actually fix the car and drive him to see these great wonders. And I think the same might be true in Afghanistan. And so he said when he went to a place like Turkey, he always felt that he was the one who belonged to the very ancient world, and they were the ones who were super up to the moment and very plugged into what's going on. And I think maybe the fifth blessing of the modern world is that because of all the movement that we have witnessed in our lifetimes, even our hometowns are so much more interesting and diverse and I would say exotic than they were when I was growing up. I think my grandparents could never dream of meeting somebody from Vietnam or Guatemala or Ethiopia. And now just get into a cab here, go to a restaurant, enter a grocery store, and you're walking into those histories and the music and the cultures and the customs and all these things that a generation ago were only to be found on the far corners of the earth. My parents could never dream of meeting a Tibetan individual, and now I know just down the street, 20 blocks, there are Tibetan shops, Tibetan restaurants, probably Tibetan Lamas speaking, maybe even the Dalai Lama. And one of my inspirations as a traveler, I suppose, has always been almost my favorite traveler, Henry David Thoreau, who said, "It matters not how far you go, the furthest commonly the worst, all that matters is how alive you are. That nothing is uninteresting to the interested eye. That interest, in other words, doesn't inhere in a subject or a place, but in what we bring to it." And that's why Forest Hills or certain parts of New York City are just as amazing as Lhasa or Shanghai or Kyoto. And in some ways, I think there's greater importance than ever before of getting to know the other, because we're surrounded by the other. And the other is in our backyard, the other is in our neighborhood, the other is in our bedroom, the other may be in ourselves. And we always stress rightly how external migration has transformed a city like New York or Toronto or Sydney or Hong Kong, because there are 200 million people now in the world living in countries not their own, a staggering number. The number of refugees has gone up tenfold just since I was in high school. But I think what all this external migration really means is the importance of what I suppose you could call inner migration. In other words, using your imagination or conscience or eyes to dream your way into the other and to try to see the world through the eyes of somebody radically different from yourself, whether that's on 3rd Avenue or in Lhasa, Tibet. And I sometimes think there's no substitute, even as we sit on more information than ever before, there's no substitute just for that human face-to-face contact, which I suppose is what underwrites all of our journeys as travelers. That in some ways, the world, to me, sometimes seems more distant than ever before because of the illusion of closeness. And that the more we know, the more we tend to underestimate our ignorance. I think for me, a wonderful trip is when I come back home knowing less than when I set out. And I may, I suppose, draw this towards a close by, again, just talking about one trip I was lucky enough to take a few years ago, which was to Yemen, and in fact to the little port in southern Yemen called Aden. And as it happened, I had been to Aden in 1959 when I was 2 years old. And in 1959, Aden was the single largest port in the world outside of Manhattan, because it was where all the British ships stopped for refueling as they went back and forth between Britain and British India. So it was buzzing with illicit deals and whispers and all kinds of activity. Well, when I went back to Aden earlier this century, I would say it was the most broken and disenfranchised place I think I've ever seen. No shops, no houses, no restaurants. There were goats foraging in the main street. When the occasional car would stop, a sunken-cheeked old woman would come and hammer at the windows, asking for a handout. And yet, it had been through 40 years of war, almost uninterrupted, all against all, the British, the Russians, North Yemen, South Yemen. And yet, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, and as in so many parts of the world, the people who had pretty much nothing couldn't have been kinder to me, a virtual millionaire, did everything they could to make me feel at home. I remember one day I was sitting in the lobby of my hotel, and a local gentleman came up to me and said, "Oh, well, would you like a guide? Would you like me to show you around?" I said, "Yeah, please. What is there to see?" And he said, "The cemetery." And we spent a long afternoon just walking around the graveyard, seeing the graves of his father and his mother, his sister, some nuns. Anybody who'd really tried to be of help to Yemen had ended up there. And then I went back to the hotel lobby, and one of the hotel workers came up to me and said, "Sir, your flight out tomorrow morning has been postponed." I said, "Oh, that's no problem. By how much?" And he said, 4 days. And the way he said it, I thought, well, it sounds more like 4 years or 4 eternities. Aden seemed so far from anything I recognized as the world. I thought there's a good chance I'll never be able to get out of this place. And I had to meet my wife in Athens the following day, and all my editors were clamoring for me to deliver various articles. So I raced in the falling light across Aden to the Yemenia office, that's the national carrier there, and there was a woman in a black veil waiting there, and I presented my predicament to her. And she very laboriously checked out all the options on the computer and said the only way you can leave is by driving right now all the way across the country to Sana'a in the north and getting a flight that leaves at 6 in the morning. And this was not very welcome news because, as I say, North Yemen had been at war with South Yemen for many of the preceding years. I also happened to know that the main source of revenue in the villages en route was the kidnapping of foreigners. And I knew that the drive would involve not just pitch blackness, but being on a mountain road with a sheer precipice on one side. But I realized I had no option. So I said, yeah, all right, I'll sign up for it. And she very kindly made up a new ticket for me. And she found out that my new ticket was in fact worth $40 less than my old ticket, and very fastidiously gave me the $40 refund. Then I found an old man who was so desperate or impoverished that he agreed to risk his life, really, by driving me then and there at the dead of night right the way across the country. I was pretty sure he'd never been behind the wheel of a car before, but I was in no condition to negotiate. And we had this really harrowing, hair-raising trip through the mountains with the tower houses eerily shining at us through the dark. And we'd go around a curve and there'd be a roadblock and a cluster of teenage boys waving AK-47s would arrive throughout the car, and the driver would pay them off, and we'd drive for 10 more minutes, and then be more boys with more guns, and it went on and on and on. But finally, miraculously, we got to Sana'a just in time for me to run into the airport and make the 6 a.m. flight. And so 3 hours later, I was in Dubai, next to a 7-star hotel and with Maseratis for sale in the airport terminal. And 5 days later, I was in Santa Barbara, which is not so different from Dubai in that regard. And of course, I think like anybody who'd just been through that, I was sitting in my desk and I was thinking how I could possibly put Yemen even in the same sentence as this rather gated, privileged town above the beach in California. They seem to belong really to different universes. And I was sitting at my desk, literally trying to bring them together. And my mother suddenly came in and she said, that place that you were in 5 weeks ago, Yemen, everybody is talking about it because there are these planes flying into the World Trade Center, and everybody is telling us that Yemen is the center of the terrorist threat against our country, and Yemen is the epicenter of evil, and it's our duty in some ways to extirpate it from the face of the earth. And as we were reminded 10 days ago, Yemen is the single greatest terrorist threat to our country, according to the National Security Council right now. It's a failed state. No government in its right mind wants to do business with Sana'a. And I heard a couple of, I guess 2 weeks ago, that the numbers in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is based in Yemen, are increasing very, very quickly. And I heard an expert say that there are 700 members of that organization in Yemen. And let's say they're supported by 10,000 or 20,000, even 30,000 Yemenites. But there are 24 million people in Yemen. And I was so grateful, just as a stumbling, bungling tourist with not a clue in the world where I was going or what I was doing, that as I was hearing about Yemen as the center of all evil, I could put a face and a voice to it. And I could think of that man in the graveyard, and think of the woman who'd been so kind to me in the airline office, and think of the poor old man who had to make that whole trip back again after dropping me. And I was also just so grateful, as a bungling traveler, that I'd learned about the 16th century skyscrapers in Hadramul. Astonishing things, 9 to 15 stories high in southern Yemen, which I hadn't known much about before, and that I'd seen those tower houses, and I'd seen the UNESCO-protected World Heritage City of Sana'a, which is one of the oldest continuously occupied cities in the world. And I thought, just by stumbling through this place, somehow I could maybe see a larger dimension than just what the news was reporting. And of course, if you go to a place like Yemen, you can't fail but see New York City differently if you come back here. Sometimes I think wisdom can come from the least expected sources. And I'm not necessarily a great friend of G.K. Chesterton, but he said this wonderful thing, which is that we need, when we consider the world, to combine a sense of wonder with a sense of welcome. And he said we need to be happy in this wonderland without being merely comfortable. And then he posed this wonderful question: how can we remain at once astonished by the world and at home in it? Which I think is exactly the question that every traveler, and certainly the WMF, is every day considering. And as I said at the beginning, more than 50 years ago, my father did a radio dialogue with Arnold Toynbee for UNESCO, and their subject was what they called the glass curtain. And they felt that in the days of the Iron Curtain, the glass curtain, which has to do with projections and misconceptions and notions, was in some ways more dangerous because more invisible and more see-through, and yet it was dividing people as much as the political differences. And my father, as a product of British India, said, I suppose a little bit as I've been saying, that in many ways the Indians were really grateful to the British. And I think as he would see it, every Indian he knew longed for independence and wanted the British ultimately to go back to Britain, but they were so grateful at the same time to the British for bringing them the language of the King James Bible and Shakespeare and cricket and P.G. Wodehouse and the rites that surround tea. And of course in the 19th century it was Europeans who were digging up sutras in India and excavating the deer park at Sarnath. Essentially Europeans who were excavating India's past and reminding India of how much it had to be grateful for within its own boundaries. And at the end of their conversation, Professor Toynbee ended with one sentence, which I think is just perfect. And he said, "Let us abandon the word foreign in all languages." And I think 53 years after that discussion, he would be so happy that CNN, for example, never uses the word foreign because it assumes that there are no foreigners in the world, that we're all part of a single community. I flew in to New York yesterday on United Airlines, and I noticed in Newark Airport a new advertising billboard that they have up that says the word foreign is almost obsolete. And I think maybe the sixth and final blessing of the modern world is that nothing is foreign. Thank you for listening so patiently to such a long babble. Now we have some time for questions and answers, so please, we have microphones on both aisles, and if you want to ask any questions about, not just about what I talked about, but anything under the sun, please don't hesitate. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a terrific talk. I'm going to start off because I know that our group is not shy, but somebody has to be the first. So I had the pleasure of corresponding with you for the 9 months, as you kindly said, and we had a lot of wide-ranging conversations about places and how we experience place. And I just wonder if there's, some place that truly has touched you. You've talked about a lot of places, so I know that there is, but I wonder if there's any particular place that touched you in a way you hadn't expected and has stayed with you in some way.
Thank you so much. Well, I will now keep us here till 4 tomorrow morning. The first place that instantly jumps to mind is Cuba. And I'd say it's the most complicated place I've ever been. I'd say it's the happiest, the saddest, the most disenchanted, the most passionate, the most beautiful in many ways. Certainly I'd say Havana is one of the most beautiful cities that I've ever seen. And it goes back actually to what I was saying about Yemen in terms of your question. It struck me in unexpected ways because I knew so little about Cuba before I went there. I thought some of my friends told me it was a socialist paradise. Some of my friends told me it was a totalitarian hell. Nobody told me about the human texture and the fact that the Cubans are so resourceful, buoyant, effervescent. They've almost kept the island floating single-handedly for the last 53 years. Yes, 53 years. And I think one of the things I love about Cuba, my definition of a good place is a place that you never leave behind. And Cuba, every moment, presents you with so many emotional and moral dilemmas that you never can get them out of your head, even after you return to New York or Santa Barbara. They keep turning. Every moment has great stakes for the people in Cuba, and fewer stakes, perhaps, for the visitor. And of course, it's politically fascinating. It's historically interesting because it's like walking through a museum of the American Empire. It's physically as ravishing as anywhere on earth, but nothing akin to the rest of the Caribbean. But also, as a foreigner, and especially like most foreigners, I instantly fell in love with Cuba. So I went there first in 1987. And the day I came back to Santa Barbara, I went to my travel agent and arranged for another trip back to Cuba 3 months later. And then I went year after year after year. And in those days, it was a doubly interesting place because the only foreigners you would see were people walking around in suits in their heat of the tropics in mid-July with little pictures of Kim Il-sung on them, North Koreans visiting their communist friend. But you didn't see many people from this country or from Europe. It was mostly Russians and North Koreans and Bulgarians eating tinned peaches in the breakfast room of the crumbling Hotel Nacional, a tropical country where the only peaches are from a tin, and probably from Bulgaria or North Korea. But, I mean, fascinating in all those ways, but most of all, because I suppose it reminded me how big the world is. Just as I was saying, we hear how small our world is, and my sense is our misconceptions about people are larger than ever. And I remember, in particular, one day, I was sitting across the street from the museum, from the university in Havana, and I was talking to a group of kids of college age. And they, of course, spoke much better English than I spoke Spanish. They knew much, much more about this country than I knew about their country. Very sophisticated, cosmopolitan kids, so they'd never had a chance to leave Havana, of the kind that you might meet in Paris or Madrid, say. And very soon the question inevitably came up, where do you come from? And I knew, because I'd already been to Cuba 5 times, that the right answer was the United States. Because in those days, but I think it's still the case now, almost every Cuban you meet has a brother or sister, father or mother, sometimes even a husband or wife in this country. But because of the official enmity between the governments in those pre-email days, letters never went back and forth, telephone calls were next to impossible, and so people were suffering, I suppose, a kind of emotional amputation. And so as soon as I said I was from California, one young man's eyes lit up. He said, "Oh, goodness, my brother lives in California, and he's got this huge house and tennis courts, swimming pools, 4 or 5 cars. Please, please, will you take a letter to my brother? Because I'm really hoping he can do something, anything, to get me out of the privation and difficulty of life in Cuba and get me to the United States, of which I dream so much." And of course I said yes, though I knew from my previous trips in Cuba that after about a week I would gather 30 or 40 of such letters. And when I got to Santa Barbara, I would send them out, and some of them would arrive on the doorsteps of Cubans who, having arrived in the United States, never wanted to think about Cuba again and would just toss them out. And many of them would arrive on the doorsteps of Cubans who, having come to this country, ended up in the darkest or most dangerous parts of New York or Miami and literally died. Nothing in Cuba had prepared them for our inner cities. And so the letters would come back to me saying, addressee unknown. But on this occasion, for the first time ever, suddenly, 1 week later, a letter came back from the brother who was living in this little town I'd never heard of before called Tamal, California. And he said, "Dear Pico Iyer, thank you for passing on the letter from my brother in Havana. And I think about him, I think about Havana all the time. And I don't know if my brother knows or if you know my circumstances here, but I'm in San Quentin prison. I'm on death row. I'm really hoping my brother can do something, anything, to get me out of this imprisonment, back to the Cuba I miss so much." And when I hear about our being in a small world, I think 2 brothers in countries separated by only 90 miles, neither knowing the first thing about the other's circumstances, and each more poignantly looking to the other for rescue. And I think when you travel, you run into those kind of things constantly, and forces you to think about your own life in new ways too. At least I think one of the beauties of travel is it makes you appreciate the freedoms that we take for granted very easily here, that so many people don't have. But that's a small example of why Cuba is so involving, because those kind of events happen a lot. As you walk along the Malecon, which is the seaside corniche that, with the warm air coming over the water from Florida, somebody will come up to you, a stranger will come up to you and ask you to marry her. And, another person will come up and ask you for a job with the CIA, and another person will come up to you and try to sell you a turtle. Another person will come up to you and offer you a job with the Cuban CIA. And it's all happening round the clock at top volume. And because people are deprived of many necessities there, they've been living, I'd say, for 52 years in the optative tense. They've been living in the realm of rumor and speculation. And they're always, and especially the kind who want to approach foreigners at a time when there were very few foreigners there, are the ones, the self-selecting group who want to escape. And so instantly these dramas are brought to your doorstep, and the riddles of kindness that travel throws up. So my 3 favorite places are probably Cuba, Tibet, and Japan, and I spoke about the second 2 in my talk, but Cuba would be the one I omitted. Thank you. Yes, please.
You're a man of great enthusiasm, so maybe disappointed?
For those of you who couldn't hear, the question is if I've ever gone somewhere and been disappointed. And I can't answer that question because there may be somebody from Atlanta, Georgia in this room. So, no. I could say I went to Brunei once, and I'm not sure I was disappointed there, but I found it really, really hard to find anything to do. I went for a 4-day trip, and I was in the capital, which you can walk around in maybe 25 minutes. So I saw the statue of Winston Churchill, I saw the library, and then I thought, what do I do for the next 71 hours? So I think I turned on the TV. And suddenly there were American programs, but edited or subtitled for a Brunei audience, and they became actually quite interesting. And I think one of the beauties of travel is that when you're abroad, even the things that you would never think twice about at home become rather interesting, whether it's the phone book in Bhutan, for example, which points out that you can make urgent distress or emergency calls, but then you notice they all go to exactly the same number. Or a McDonald's even. You know, I know a lot of people are worried that the world is getting very homogeneous, but my sense is that because wherever you get off the plane tomorrow, you'll be greeted by Ronald McDonald and the Starbucks logo and probably an ad for Brad Pitt in Moneyball, let's say. But my sense is that all the world is perhaps drawing on the same pool of largely American pop cultural images, but translating them into their own terms, their own accent. Everybody is singing Adele in a different accent, and so it's still as diverse as ever before. And when I was in Japan, for example, 2 weeks ago in my home, when I go to the McDonald's there, the first thing I notice when I look up on the menu is that they serve moon-viewing burgers in late September in honor of the great ancestral East Asian festival of the harvest moon. And chicken tatsuda burgers, bacon potato pies, pear sorbets, things I couldn't begin to explain to you. The second thing that I notice is that most of the customers there are young women, and they're dressed in Dior or Gucci or Vivienne Westwood. And the third and most important thing I notice is that everything about the way they speak and don't speak and cover their mouths when they laugh and carry themselves is just as Japanese, I think, as it would have been in the 15th century. I know I'm not in Kansas anymore when I go there. And sometimes that same week I'll find myself in my parents' India, and I'll go out of curiosity to a McDonald's in Delhi. And there, of course, nearly all the items on the menu are vegetarian. The most popular is pizza, and the smell of spiced cardamom tea. And everything is as raucous and intense and overcrowded and clamorous as the streets and the city and the country outside. You know very quickly you're not in Japan there. And then sometimes maybe the following month I'll be in La Paz, Bolivia, and as I walk down the beautiful promenade there of the Prado, I will see a McDonald's, and it's such a status symbol in Bolivia that there will be an armed guard on permanent duty outside the front door. There's a display case inside it with a Seiko watch. The prices are higher than in the chic French cafe next door. And it's become something in a Bolivian context that's radically unlike India, Japan, or Kansas. And so I think the world is quite inexhaustible. And maybe that's not a product of my enthusiasm, but a cause of it, which is that wherever I go in the world, I tend to be as surprised and startled as ever I would have been. I don't think we're beginning to all look or sound like one another. Thank you. Very shy audience. Oh, yes.
Do you have a methodology that, I know you go from place to place, would that I would too, but is there a, how do you plot it, or don't you? You simply walk out of the airport, take a bus into town, and go from there with your notebook? I am assuming you travel alone to all these.
I do. I most enjoy traveling alone. And my great piece of high technology is indeed this, my notebook, in which I scribble everything down as it happens in a hand so small and fast I usually can't read it. And most of my constructive word choices come from misreading my own handwriting. But in terms of logistics, I suppose I plan things out fairly carefully before I go to a place. So I have some rough idea of how I'm going to spend my 14 days. And then the minute I arrive, all those plans go out the window. but the planning gives me the security to enjoy the throwing the plans out. In the same way as if I were needing to drive to JFK tomorrow, I would meticulously find out how to follow all the roads to get there. And then once I felt I knew it, that would give me the freedom to diverge and to get lost and not to get worried by getting lost, because I knew ultimately how to arrive in the place. And I think one of the beauties of travel is that before I go to a place like Syria, I'm sure I know everything about it. And as soon as I arrive, I see I didn't know a thing. And it's as if you're moving instantly from black and white to color. Suddenly I realize that before I saw it only through abstractions. And once I get there, even what the guidebook has told me suddenly doesn't obtain very much. I do have two great advantages over most of you in this room. One is being a male, and I think I would not wander and get lost quite in the same way if I were a woman. And the second, of course, is my complexion, which allows me to fade into the background and really to pass as a native, whether I'm in Cuba or the Middle East or Indonesia or South America, so many places, and that allows me to be that much more inconspicuous. And I tend to use the Lonely Planet books a lot, especially for their very good maps, though I don't use them for their hotels. And when I have, I've regretted it for years thereafter. And in terms of choosing my places, I think I follow intuition. I think, like all of you, I read a lot. And so my criterion is I want to go to a place as unlike Japan and California as possible, and the kind of places I don't know about. So I remember when I began traveling, I went to the places covered by the Trading with an Enemy Act, not because I wanted to befriend our enemies, but because, as I was just saying, they were the places I thought I would never know much about in California, North Korea in those days, Cuba, China, and Vietnam. Then in the early 90s, we began hearing about the information revolution, and I thought, well, there must be a lot of countries still stuck in the sort of disinformation or misinformation revolution. So I went to places like Bhutan and Iceland and Paraguay that were very isolated and that put my notions into a kind of perspective. And then at the end of the last century, when we were hearing how computers were the unacknowledged legislators of mankind and our country was enjoying great prosperity, I thought maybe this is a time to go to some of the poorest nations on earth and be reminded that 2/3 of the population, of my global population, has never even used a telephone. So that's when I went to Yemen and Ethiopia and Cambodia and Haiti and Bolivia. And then in this century, before 9/11, but also after, I've been going to the Islamic countries a lot. Yemen, Oman, Syria, Jordan, last year Dubai, and especially, I suppose, Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. I'd say Damascus, Beirut, and Jerusalem are three of the most charismatic cities I've ever visited, but all in radically different ways. And I'm of Hindu ancestry, and I think almost the first moral obligation of a Hindu is, as I was saying, to try to see the world through Islamic eyes. So that's how I choose the places. And to go back to the gentleman's earlier question, few have disappointed me. They've all been even more foreign and various and intriguing than I had imagined. And when I was talking about responsibility earlier, I realized one of the things that never, or almost never, shows up in travel books or guidebooks or travel articles goes back to your question about traveling alone, the domestic responsibilities and the way every traveler feels a little guilty as he says goodbye to his wife and goes off to have a great time in Havana. And by chance, I read a wonderful book recently that's coming out in the fall that's written by somebody who recently won the Travel Writer of the Year award, but also was famous to many people as an actor, Andrew McCarthy. And it's a wonderful book about the traveler's infidelity, you could call it, the traveler's guilt. How every time you say goodbye to your wife and kids and you go to Patagonia or Zimbabwe or wherever it happens to be, a part of you wonders, what am I running from? How can I justify this? Why am I going to this far corner of the world and not content with my own plot? And it's a wonderful way of looking at responsibility in a very intimate way. Oh, yes, maybe two more questions and then we'll all disperse. Yes, please, sir.
You don't mention any travels to either Europe or Africa. Is this on purpose?
Not on the Europe part a little. And I think just because I was born and grew up in England, it's the only country in the world, I'm afraid, that has no interest for me whatsoever. And I try hard to make it glamorous, romantic, exotic, and I can't The closest I've done is go to Japan, which is like a version of England, but with indecipherable characters, a foreign version of England. So because I grew up in Europe, I love going back there now, but it seems something more in my backyard and closer to the world that I experienced. In Africa, alas, it's just ignorance on my part. I've been in North Africa a little bit, but in sub-Saharan Africa, I've only been to Ethiopia and South Africa. So that's a huge unexplored continent for me. And for those of you who are looking for a place of absolute intensity and devotion, akin to what I was describing in the Jokang Temple in Lhasa, Tibet, the only place I've found somewhat very comparable to that is Ethiopia. And I mentioned Lalibela in my talk. And I was in Ethiopia 19 years ago, and it's again a place I've never forgotten, partly because of the way the poverty of the country played off against the intense devotion and devotion to the religion and pride in a culture that has remained unchanged for so long, and just the magic and integrity of that place. I went at the end of the year, which is when they celebrate the Christmas, and I'll never forget traveling around Addis Ababa on Christmas Eve when all the people gather in the graveyards holding candles and singing hymns, and the churches are absolutely thronged. I've never seen anything akin to it in any Christian nation. It shakes you to the core because you're essentially back in the Book of Kings. You step through the landscape of the Bible in Ethiopia. And when you go to Lalibela, which I know is one of the World Monuments Fund's main concerns for many, many years, and you see the piercing eyes of the priests in those underground caves in purple robes with the rainbowed umbrellas above them, and the worshippers who've again walked for weeks on end, all dressed in white, and the light coming through the cross-shaped windows, and the little boys playing tag around places called Bethlehem and the River Jordan, and all the great biblical sites. There's no way you ever leave Ethiopia behind. But I wish I knew more about Africa, and I don't. And last question, yes, please. Yes,
early in your talk, you mentioned how Kyoto was losing in the development. It was losing some aspect of its sight lines to distant mountains. And I wondered whether you could comment on that in a broader scale, whether you found some countries better or cities better able to balance development with the preservation of beautiful views or sight lines.
It's a wonderful question. I've never been asked it before, and I've probably never thought about it before, so I'm not sure that I have an answer. I think Japan has been fairly good about preserving some of its sites. I think the drawback is in a place like Kyoto, there are 5 temples that everybody goes to, and every Japanese schoolchild is forced to go to as part of her education. So those 5 are beautifully preserved, and the other 1,995 are to some extent neglected, which means for us, when you go to Kyoto, go to those other 1,995, and they're just as beautiful, but nobody is there. But I think, again, my ignorance of Europe probably cost me with this question, because I think a lot of the European countries, when I've been in recent years to France, Italy, and Spain, it seems that they managed to balance the old and the new rather wisely, and maybe have a very cosmopolitan global sense of what is unique to their heritage and what shouldn't be defiled or defaced in any way, and yet also are very plugged into the modern age. I even like I.M. Pei's pyramid over the Louvre, but certainly whenever I walk around the streets of Paris, I'm enchanted at how they've managed to preserve the 19th century ideal while having every convenience that I would find in California and many more besides. So I think I was in Zurich not so long ago, and they seemed beautifully to be honoring the Calvinist past while also making life as easy as it possibly could be. Last summer, my mother turned 80, and I took her on a cruise to St. Petersburg, and we went through the Scandinavian countries, and places like Stockholm and Copenhagen, though I don't know them well, made a good first impression. Tallinn, too, in terms of putting you very quickly in the 16th century, but the 21st century was around the corner. But I'm guessing that might be a question you would be much better positioned to answer, or somebody here. But thank you very much for that. Thank you all very much for listening.